It was October 2022, and the streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, were a picture of perfection. The golden hues of fall leaves blanketed the manicured lawns, while stately mansions stood proud against the crisp blue sky. Behind the walls of one such grand estate lived Marilyn Harper, a woman of elegance and poise. At 65, Marilyn had everything one could dream of: wealth, a stunning home, and an impeccable collection of art. But beneath the surface of this idyllic life lay a profound void. 3 years ago, Marilyn had lost her husband of 40 years to a sudden heart attack. Since then, she had withdrawn from the world, retreating into the quiet confines of her sprawling estate. Her days were a predictable routine of tending to her garden, flipping through photo albums, and staring at the paintings that once filled her with pride. The gallery she had run for decades was closed now, and so, it seemed, was a part of her soul. Her children, Elena and Theo Harper, had moved on with their own lives. Elena, a fiercely ambitious attorney in New York City, rarely had time for lengthy visits. Theo, a tech entrepreneur based in San Francisco, was even more distant, his calls sporadic and brief. Marilyn often reassured herself that this was the natural course of life, children growing up and living their own dreams. Yet, the silence in her home often grew deafening, a stark reminder of her solitude. That autumn, the emptiness weighed heavier than ever. On one particularly still evening, Marilyn found herself standing before her late husband's portrait. His warm smile, captured on canvas, seemed to mock her isolation. In that moment, she resolved to step outside her bubble of grief. It was time to feel alive again. The opportunity arose in an unexpected invitation, a gala at a prestigious art gallery in New York City, showcasing works from emerging artists. Marilyn hesitated. It had been years since she'd attended such an event. The thought of mingling among strangers, especially in her current state, made her chest tighten. But the memory of the vibrant woman she once was urged her forward. That Friday evening, she donned a sleek black dress, slipped on her pearls, and drove to the city. The gallery was a spectacle of sophistication. Gentle classical music played in the background as attendees sipped champagne and murmured in hushed tones about the art. Marilyn wandered through the room, taking in the bold strokes of abstract paintings and the intricate detail of sculptures. She felt a pang of nostalgia for her days as a gallery owner, curating exhibitions and mingling with artists. But tonight, she was merely an observer, a shadow of her former self. It was as she stood admiring a particularly striking painting that he appeared. Daniel Chase, a man who exuded effortless charm, accidentally spilled a few drops of his drink near her shoes. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of genuine concern and boyish charm. Marilyn turned, startled, and found herself looking into a pair of captivating hazel eyes. Daniel flashed an apologetic smile that instantly disarmed her. "It's quite all right," Marilyn replied, her voice steady, though she felt a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "You have impeccable taste," Daniel said, gesturing to the painting she'd been admiring. "This piece is extraordinary, dynamic yet deeply introspective." Marilyn's eyes widened slightly. His observation was insightful, almost too much so for someone his age. They began to chat, initially about the painting, then about art in general. Daniel confessed he was an avid admirer of contemporary works but claimed he lacked the expertise someone like Marilyn clearly had. Over the next half hour, their conversation flowed seamlessly. Marilyn found herself laughing at his witty remarks and intrigued by his thoughtful observations. Daniel was not only handsome, with his chiseled features and impeccable suit, but also seemingly well-read and genuinely interested in her opinions. "I must admit," he said, leaning in slightly, "it's rare to meet someone with such depth and passion for art. You remind me of the kind of people I'd hoped to surround myself with when I moved to Stamford. Sadly, those connections have been lacking." Marilyn couldn't recall the last time someone had complimented her so earnestly. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement. As the evening wound down, Daniel reached for his pocket and handed her a sleek business card. "I'd love to hear more about your perspective on art. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over coffee?" Marilyn hesitated, the old voice of caution whispering in her mind. But then she saw the sincere warmth in his smile and found herself nodding. "That sounds lovely." As Marilyn drove home that night, the lights of New York City twinkling in her rearview mirror, she felt something stir within her, a spark she thought had been extinguished forever. Little did she know, that spark would soon ignite a fire that would consume everything in its path. In the days following the gala, Marilyn Harper felt an unusual sense of anticipation. The polished silver business card Daniel Chase had given her rested on her nightstand, catching the light each morning as if daring her to make a move. She hadn't felt this giddy in years, but a flicker of doubt lingered, reminding her of the age gap and the unlikely circumstances of their meeting. Still, the memory of his charming smile and the way he seemed to hang on her every word played on a loop in her mind. By the third day, curiosity overpowered caution. She picked up the card and dialed the number. His voice, warm and enthusiastic, answered after the first ring. "Marilyn," Daniel said, as though he'd been waiting for her call. "I was hoping I'd hear from you." That Sunday, they met for coffee at a quaint café tucked away in Greenwich's bustling downtown. Marilyn arrived early, her nerves crackling beneath her carefully chosen cashmere sweater and string of pearls. When Daniel walked in, impeccably dressed in a tailored jacket, he turned heads. But his attention was fixed solely on Marilyn. He greeted her with a smile that made her forget, if only for a moment, the 3 decades between them. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Daniel shared bits about his life, how he'd grown up in a small Connecticut town, how he'd developed a passion for art, and how he was now exploring opportunities to curate exhibitions himself. He seemed modest yet ambitious, a rare mix that left Marilyn intrigued. "You're quite an inspiration," Daniel said, leaning forward. "Running your own gallery, building a reputation in the art world, it must have taken incredible vision and tenacity." Marilyn blushed, caught off guard by the compliment. "It was a labor of love," she admitted. "But that was a long time ago." "That kind of vision doesn't fade," he said earnestly. "It's clear you still have it." Marilyn couldn't help but smile. For years, she'd been defined by her grief, by what she had lost. Daniel's words reminded her of who she used to be, a woman of passion and purpose. Their coffee date turned into a stroll through Greenwich Avenue, stopping to peer into boutique windows and talk about everything from art to their favorite books. By the time they parted ways, Daniel had secured an invitation to see Marilyn's home and her famed art collection the following weekend. Over the next few weeks, Daniel became a fixture in Marilyn's life. He called her regularly, sending thoughtful texts throughout the day. "Hope your garden is thriving, it's such a beautiful reflection of you." Or, "I just saw a painting that reminded me of your stunning collection. Can't wait to hear your thoughts." Marilyn found herself eagerly awaiting his messages. They dined at upscale restaurants, attended art events, and even spent quiet afternoons discussing her collection in her home's private gallery. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen and appreciated, something she hadn't experienced in years. "You bring such light into a room," he told her one evening over dinner at a chic Manhattan bistro. "I don't think you realize how extraordinary you are." At first, Marilyn was wary. She had spent her life surrounded by people who praised her work, her taste, her elegance, but this felt different. Daniel's admiration seemed genuine, personal. Against her better judgment, she began to let her guard down. Still, doubts crept in from time to time. The age difference was undeniable, and Marilyn wondered what people might think. During one of their dinners, she finally voiced her concern. "Daniel," she began hesitantly, "don't you think it's unusual, someone like you spending so much time with someone like me?" "Unusual," he echoed, as if the thought had never crossed his mind. "Marilyn, age means nothing to me. What I see is someone with grace, intelligence, and a passion for life. That's rare, and I'd be a fool not to treasure it." His words melted her defenses. For the first time in years, Marilyn felt truly alive, as though the weight of her grief had been lifted. She began to crave his presence, his attention, and the sense of renewal he brought to her world. Unbeknownst to Marilyn, Daniel's affection wasn't as pure as it seemed. Beneath his attentive demeanor lay a calculated strategy. Over the course of their meetings, he subtly began to steer their conversations toward her lifestyle and possessions. "This home is stunning," he said during a quiet afternoon at her estate. "It reflects your taste perfectly. It's inspiring to see someone who values beauty so deeply." Marilyn thanked him, but Daniel pressed further. "Do you ever treat yourself to new pieces? Or travel to find inspiration? I imagine you deserve to enjoy more of the beauty you've created." The suggestion planted a seed. Marilyn hadn't shopped for herself in years, hadn't indulged in anything beyond her usual routines. Encouraged by Daniel's flattery, she began to consider the idea. Soon after, Daniel accompanied her on a trip to a luxury boutique in Greenwich. "This color would look perfect on you," he said, holding up a vibrant silk scarf. Marilyn hesitated, but Daniel's approval tipped the scales. She purchased it, feeling a flicker of the joy she used to experience in simpler times. By the end of November, Marilyn's life had undergone a quiet transformation. Her days, once marked by loneliness, were now filled with the excitement of Daniel's company. Her wardrobe brightened, her social calendar filled, and her once muted laughter returned. Yet, beneath the surface, subtle shifts were occurring. Marilyn began covering more of their dinners, their outings, their tickets to exclusive events. Daniel insisted on paying at first, but his charm quickly turned to humility. "You've worked so hard for everything you have," he said one evening. "It's inspiring to see someone so generous." What Marilyn didn't realize was that Daniel was testing the waters, gauging just how far her generosity could stretch. And as Marilyn leaned further into her newfound happiness, she unwittingly opened the door to a danger she had yet to see. By early December 2022, Marilyn Harper's world seemed brighter than it had been in years. Her days were filled with dinners at exclusive restaurants, gallery tours, and long walks through the picturesque streets of Greenwich with Daniel Chase by her side. Her home, once a quiet sanctuary of solitude, now buzzed with his lively presence. Daniel had brought back a spark Marilyn thought she had lost forever. But while Marilyn reveled in her newfound joy, her children, Elena and Theo Harper, were growing increasingly uneasy. They had noticed changes in their mother. Her wardrobe was noticeably more vibrant, her spending habits more extravagant, and her once consistent calls to them had grown sporadic. Elena, ever the protective daughter, was the first to voice her concerns. Over coffee during one of her rare visits to Greenwich, she broached the subject cautiously. "Mom," she began, stirring her cappuccino, "you seem different lately. Happier, which is wonderful. But I can't help but notice how quickly things are moving with this Daniel." Marilyn's smile faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Elena, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." "I'm not saying you're not," Elena replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. You've only known him for a couple of months, and already—" "Elena, stop." Marilyn's voice was sharp, cutting her daughter off. "You don't know him like I do. Daniel has been nothing but kind and supportive. He makes me feel alive again." Elena hesitated, taken aback by her mother's uncharacteristic defensiveness. "Mom, I'm happy you're feeling good, but—" "No buts," Marilyn said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This is my life, Elena. Please respect that." The conversation left Elena unsettled. She called her brother Theo that evening, recounting the changes she'd noticed in their mother and the troubling conversation they'd had. "She's not thinking straight," Elena said, pacing her Manhattan apartment. "She's letting this guy charm her into spending money she wouldn't normally spend. I know it sounds paranoid, but I think he's using her." Theo, listening from his sleek office in San Francisco, sighed. "You know Mom, she's stubborn. If we push too hard, she'll just dig her heels in. So what do we do? Just sit back and watch while this guy drains her bank account?" "No," Theo replied after a pause. "I'll fly out for the holidays. Maybe if we both talk to her, she'll see reason." The family gathered at Marilyn's home for Christmas, but the festive atmosphere was quickly overshadowed by tension. Daniel, to the siblings' dismay, was a constant presence. He moved through the Harper estate with the ease of someone who belonged there, charming the staff and cracking jokes as if he were part of the family. He even brought elaborate gifts for Elena and Theo, an expensive silk tie for Theo and a designer bracelet for Elena, making it difficult for them to openly criticize him. During Christmas dinner, Elena couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom," she said, setting down her fork, "we need to talk about Daniel." Marilyn stiffened, her smile fading. "What about him? Have you ever thought about how quickly things are moving? How much time and money you're spending on him?" Elena pressed. "I mean, do you even know his background? Where he comes from?" "Enough," Marilyn snapped, her voice icy. "You have no right to question my choices." "I have every right," Elena countered. "You're my mother, and I care about you. This isn't like you, Mom. You've always been so careful, so discerning. Don't patronize me." Marilyn's voice rose, silencing the room. "You don't know what it's like to feel alone, to lose the person you've shared your life with. Daniel has given me something I haven't felt in years, happiness. And instead of supporting me, all you do is judge." Theo, usually the peacemaker, interjected. "Mom, we're not judging you. We just want to make sure you're okay. This feels rushed." Marilyn's glare shifted to him. "I don't need you or Elena telling me how to live my life. If you can't be happy for me, then maybe you shouldn't be here." The confrontation left the siblings frustrated and worried. Later that evening, they retreated to the guest house to discuss their next steps. "She's completely under his spell," Elena said, pacing the room. "I don't know how to get through to her." "I don't think we can," Theo admitted, his tone heavy with resignation. "Not right now. She's too defensive. Maybe we back off for now and keep an eye on things from a distance." Elena frowned but nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if he so much as asks her for a dime, I'm stepping in." Meanwhile, Daniel seized the opportunity to drive a wedge deeper between Marilyn and her children. In quiet moments, he planted seeds of doubt. "They don't understand you like I do," he would say, his voice soothing. "They just see the money and the estate. That's all they care about." Marilyn, still stinging from the confrontation, found comfort in Daniel's words. "I suppose you're right," she admitted. "They've been so distant for years, and now suddenly they're concerned." "They're not bad people," Daniel continued, always careful not to push too hard. "But they don't see the real you. They're stuck in the past, in their image of you as just Mom. You deserve more than that." Under Daniel's influence, Marilyn began pulling away from her children even further. She stopped answering their calls, excusing it as needing space after the holiday confrontation. Friends, too, noticed her increasing reclusiveness. Invitations to lunches and charity events went unanswered, leaving Marilyn's once active social circle bewildered. "Why bother?" Daniel would say when Marilyn mentioned her friends. "They've never truly supported you. They just want gossip to share over cocktails." And so, bit by bit, Daniel isolated Marilyn, positioning himself as her sole confidant and ally. By the time January rolled around, she barely noticed how small her world had become, or how much control he now held over her life. By February 2023, Marilyn Harper's life was a stark contrast to the one she had known just a few months prior. Her once-staid routines had been replaced with outings to upscale restaurants, impulsive shopping sprees, and long evenings spent in Daniel Chase's captivating company. Her world revolved around him, and she had come to depend on the light he brought into her life. Yet, beneath the surface of this whirlwind romance, unease began to creep in. It started with a single moment. On a crisp February evening, as Daniel sat across from her in the living room of her Greenwich estate, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He made no move to pick it up, but Marilyn couldn't help noticing the name that flashed briefly on the screen: Sophia Carter. A fleeting smile crossed his face before he quickly flipped the phone over, obscuring it from view. Marilyn felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years: jealousy. But she brushed it aside. "You're overthinking things," she told herself. "Daniel has been nothing but devoted." Still, the image of the name lingered in her mind, and doubt began to gnaw at her. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle inconsistencies in his behavior: whispered phone calls, sudden cancellations of plans with vague excuses, and his growing reluctance to share details about where he spent his time when they weren't together. The cracks in his facade were small but undeniable. One afternoon, while Daniel was out, Marilyn found herself pacing in the living room, her thoughts spiraling. She glanced at his phone, which he had carelessly left on the coffee table, its screen dark and tempting. The voice of reason told her to leave it alone, but curiosity, coupled with a growing sense of betrayal, was impossible to resist. With trembling hands, she unlocked the device. Daniel had once laughingly shared his passcode during a date, claiming he had nothing to hide. What she found shattered her carefully constructed illusion. Text messages flooded the screen, each more damning than the last. There were flirtatious exchanges with multiple women, including Sophia Carter, whose name appeared most frequently. Marilyn scrolled through thread after thread, her heart pounding as she read his charming words, the same ones he had used to win her over, directed at others. Photos of expensive dinners, lavish gifts, and trips she hadn't known about filled the gallery. The worst part was the timestamps. Many of these conversations overlapped with moments she had thought were exclusively theirs. Marilyn's hands shook as she pieced together the ugly truth. Daniel had been using her. The lavish dinners he'd promised to treat her to were, in reality, charged to her credit card. The gifts he claimed to have never received before had been carefully chosen to please other women. The apartment she had helped him rent in Stamford wasn't just his sanctuary, it was a revolving door for his other conquests. The next few days were a haze of heartbreak and rage. Marilyn withdrew into herself, replaying every moment of their relationship, searching for clues she had missed. She couldn't help but feel humiliated. How had she, a woman of intelligence and experience, fallen so completely for such a conman? Unable to contain her emotions, Marilyn called her daughter Elena and confessed her suspicions. Elena, who had never trusted Daniel, listened patiently before responding. "Mom, I hate to say this, but I think you're right," Elena said. "I've been doing some digging on my own. I hired a private investigator after Christmas." Marilyn's breath caught. "You what?" "I didn't want to upset you, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. Mom, he has a history. He's done this before, multiple times. He finds wealthy older women, charms them, and then bleeds them dry. He's even been accused of fraud, though none of the cases went to trial." Marilyn felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I knew you wouldn't listen," Elena said bluntly. "You were so wrapped up in him. I didn't want to push you away." That evening, armed with the knowledge from Elena and the evidence she had uncovered on Daniel's phone, Marilyn decided to confront him. She rehearsed what she would say, her anger simmering beneath the surface. When Daniel arrived at the estate, his demeanor was as charming as ever. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and a compliment about her dress, but Marilyn stiffened under his touch. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Daniel tilted his head, feigning concern. "Of course. Is something wrong?" Marilyn didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled out her phone and showed him the screenshots she had taken from his messages. "Explain this," she demanded. For a moment, Daniel's mask slipped. A flicker of panic crossed his face before he quickly recovered. "Marilyn," he began, his tone calm, "this is a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" she snapped, her voice rising. "I saw the messages, Daniel. The gifts, the dinners, you've been lying to me this whole time." He sighed, shifting into damage control mode. "Those women mean nothing to me," he said, reaching for her hand. "You're the one I care about. Those conversations were harmless, I swear." Marilyn yanked her hand away. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me. I know exactly what you've been doing." Daniel's demeanor shifted again, his charm giving way to frustration. "Fine," he said, his voice sharp. "So what if I've been seeing other women? Do you really think this was ever about love? You were an easy target, Marilyn. You wanted someone to make you feel alive again, and I gave you that." His words were like a knife to her chest. Marilyn's anger boiled over, her voice shaking as she shouted, "Get out of my house, and don't ever come back." Daniel smirked, his arrogance undeterred. "You'll regret this," he said before turning and walking out the door, leaving Marilyn standing alone in the middle of her once perfect home, her world shattered. The air inside Marilyn Harper's Greenwich estate was thick with tension. Days after their explosive confrontation, Daniel Chase had yet to collect his belongings or officially vacate the apartment she had helped secure for him. Marilyn thought she had seen the last of him when she threw him out, but Daniel wasn't finished. A simmering storm of anger and humiliation brewed within her, threatening to boil over. On the surface, Marilyn tried to carry on as if everything was normal. She threw herself into her routines, gardening, rearranging her art collection, and even attempting to reconnect with her estranged friends. But nothing felt the same. Every corner of her home reminded her of Daniel, his smooth laughter that once echoed through the halls, the scarves and trinkets he had complimented her on, the memories of evenings that now felt like lies. It was on a cold March evening that Daniel reappeared, unannounced, at her doorstep. His face was a mask of calm confidence, his charm as effortless as ever. Marilyn hesitated, her hand gripping the doorframe tightly. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, her voice cold but trembling. "To talk," he replied smoothly. "You've been avoiding me. I think we should settle this like adults." Marilyn considered slamming the door in his face but hesitated. Part of her wanted closure, an explanation that might make sense of his betrayal. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing him into the warmth of her living room. Daniel wasted no time making himself at home, lounging in the chair he had claimed as his own during their relationship. Marilyn stayed standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Say what you need to say, and then leave," she said, her tone clipped. "I think you're overreacting," Daniel began, his voice annoyingly calm. "Sure, I made some mistakes, but we had something good, Marilyn. I don't see why you're throwing it all away." Marilyn's eyes narrowed. "Throwing it away? You used me, Daniel. You lied to me, manipulated me, and bled me dry. I gave you what you needed," he countered, leaning forward. "Companionship, excitement, passion. You can't deny that I brought life back into this house." "At what cost?" she snapped. "My dignity? My trust? My family? You exploited me." Daniel sighed dramatically, his facade of patience slipping. "This again? You're making it sound like I forced you to do anything. You chose to give me those things. You wanted to feel young and vibrant, and I gave you that. Maybe it's time you take responsibility for your own choices. His words hit her like a slap. Marilyn felt the sting of tears welling up in her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Get out of my house." But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Not until we talk about what you owe me." Marilyn froze. "What I owe you?" "The apartment, the dinners, the gifts," he said casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You promised to invest in me. I've been counting on that money." Marilyn's fury ignited. "You think I'm going to give you another dime after everything you've done?" Daniel's expression hardened. "You're not seeing the bigger picture, Marilyn. If you don't pay up, I might have to tell some people about our arrangement. How would your precious reputation hold up if people knew you'd been financing your boy toy?" Her heart raced. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls bearing down like a cage. Marilyn's hands clenched at her sides as a rush of adrenaline coursed through her veins. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," he sneered. The tension in the room was unbearable. Marilyn's mind reeled, her thoughts racing between panic and rage. And then, her eyes fell on the ornate bronze sculpture sitting on the nearby table. It was one of her prized possessions, a symbol of strength and resilience, a piece she had cherished for years. Without thinking, she stepped toward it, her movements slow and deliberate. "Daniel," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I gave you everything. My trust, my time, my money. And you betrayed me." He smirked. "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. You got something out of this too. You felt alive again, didn't you?" Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the sculpture. The weight of it felt steady, grounding. "No," she said quietly, tears spilling over her cheeks. "You made me feel like a fool." Before Daniel could respond, Marilyn swung the sculpture with all her strength. The blow landed squarely on the side of his head, the sickening crack of metal against bone echoing through the room. Daniel collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the floor in a lifeless heap. For a moment, Marilyn stood frozen, the sculpture still clutched in her trembling hands. Her chest heaved as she stared at Daniel's motionless body, blood pooling beneath him. The reality of what she had done sank in, crushing her under its weight. "Oh my God," she whispered, dropping the sculpture. It landed with a thud beside him. Panic took over. Her mind raced with questions. What have I done? What happens now? Driven by instinct, Marilyn began to clean the scene, her movements frantic and disjointed. She wiped the blood from the sculpture, rearranged the furniture, and even tried to stage the scene as an accident. But her hands trembled so violently that her efforts only created more chaos. As the adrenaline ebbed, Marilyn sank to the floor, sitting beside Daniel's lifeless form. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered apologies into the silence. The grandeur of her home felt hollow, every corner of the room suffused with the weight of what had transpired. In that moment, Marilyn knew her life would never be the same. The man who had brought her out of her loneliness had also led her to the edge of despair. And now, in a single act of desperation, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The days following Daniel Chase's death were a blur for Marilyn Harper. She spent her time meticulously cleaning her home, trying to erase every trace of what had happened. Yet no amount of scrubbing or rearranging could erase the image of Daniel's lifeless body from her mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo in her grand Greenwich estate, seemed to mock her with the truth she could never escape. Marilyn had acted quickly that night. Driven by panic, she called no one, instead dragging Daniel's body to his car parked discreetly at the edge of her property. She wiped the steering wheel and carefully staged the scene to make it look as though he'd had an accident while driving home. As she watched the taillights of the car disappear into the night, Marilyn told herself it was over. But deep down, she knew better. A week later, the first ripple of consequence came. Daniel's friends, noticing his absence, reported him missing. When calls and texts went unanswered, they reached out to the police. The case landed on the desk of Detective Sarah Collins, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for piecing together even the most tangled webs of lies. It wasn't long before Detective Collins learned about Marilyn Harper, the wealthy widow who had been closely tied to Daniel in his final months. The knock on Marilyn's door came early one morning, breaking the stillness of her carefully curated routine. Opening the door, she found herself face to face with Detective Collins, whose sharp eyes seemed to take in every detail of Marilyn's expression. "Mrs. Harper," the detective said politely, holding up her badge. "I'm here to ask a few questions about Daniel Chase." Marilyn's stomach tightened, but she forced a calm smile. "Of course. Come in." Seated in her living room, Marilyn played the part of the concerned acquaintance perfectly. She described her relationship with Daniel as a close friendship and feigned surprise when informed of his disappearance. "It's awful," she said, her voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "I haven't heard from him in days. I assumed he was busy with work." Detective Collins nodded, taking notes. "When was the last time you saw him?" Marilyn hesitated, her mind scrambling for the right answer. "About a week ago," she said finally. "He came by to pick up some things he'd left here. He seemed preoccupied." "Did he mention where he was going?" Collins asked, her tone neutral but probing. "No," Marilyn replied, shaking her head. "I wish I'd pressed him more. Maybe I could have helped." The detective's gaze lingered on Marilyn a moment longer than necessary before she stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. If you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to call." Marilyn nodded, closing the door behind her. The moment she was alone, she leaned against the wall, her heart pounding in her chest. She had managed to hold her composure, but it was clear the investigation had only just begun. Over the next several weeks, the pressure mounted. Detectives uncovered Daniel's history of targeting wealthy older women, painting a damning picture of a manipulative conman. Friends of Daniel came forward with stories about his expensive tastes and frequent boasting about his connections to affluent women. Financial records revealed a pattern of extravagant spending, much of which was traced back to Marilyn's accounts. As the pieces fell into place, Marilyn's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her children, Elena and Theo, were dragged into the investigation. Though they had grown suspicious of Daniel months earlier, they were blindsided by the police's questions about their mother's involvement. Elena, ever the skeptic, found herself torn between wanting to protect Marilyn and fearing what the truth might reveal. "Mom," Elena said during one of her visits, her voice heavy with concern, "is there something you're not telling us?" Marilyn avoided her daughter's gaze, the weight of her secret bearing down on her. "I've told the police everything I know," she replied, her tone defensive. "Have you?" Elena pressed, her lawyerly instincts kicking in. "Because they're digging deeper, and if there's something you're hiding, they'll find it." It was a damning piece of evidence that ultimately sealed Marilyn's fate. Detectives traced Daniel's last known location to her estate, thanks to the GPS data from his car. Confronted with this information during another visit from Detective Collins, Marilyn's composure finally shattered. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Harper," Collins said, her tone firm but not unkind, "we know Daniel was here the night he disappeared. The GPS doesn't lie. And given his history, we understand why you might have felt threatened." Marilyn froze. The detective's words hung in the air like a lifeline, offering her a way out, a chance to frame her actions as self-defense rather than premeditation. Tears welled in her eyes as she broke down, the weight of her guilt spilling out in a halting confession. She described the confrontation, the threats Daniel had made, and the fear that had driven her to act. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. I just wanted him to stop. I didn't know what else to do." Detective Collins listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. When Marilyn finished, the room fell silent, save for her quiet sobs. "I understand," Collins said softly. "But I need you to come with me." The fallout was swift and devastating. News of Marilyn's confession spread quickly, casting a spotlight on her once respected name. Headlines screamed of betrayal, manipulation, and a love affair gone tragically wrong. The Harper family was thrust into the public eye, forced to navigate the media frenzy and the painful reality of Marilyn's actions. For Elena and Theo, the betrayal cut deep. The woman they had once seen as a pillar of strength and elegance was now a criminal, her life forever tainted by a single moment of desperation. Yet, beneath their anger and sorrow lay a sliver of understanding. They couldn't condone what she had done, but they couldn't ignore the loneliness and vulnerability that had driven her to it. As Marilyn awaited trial, she found herself alone once again, confined to the stark walls of a holding cell. Each day was a painful reminder of the life she had lost, the family she had alienated, the trust she had shattered, and the man who had led her to ruin. In those quiet moments, Marilyn grappled with the weight of her choices, knowing that the path to redemption, if it existed at all, would be long and fraught with pain. The trial of Marilyn Harper was one of the most talked-about cases in Connecticut that year. The media latched onto every detail: the wealthy widow, the charming conman, and the tragic chain of events that led to Daniel Chase's death. Courtroom sketches of Marilyn, her once poised demeanor now replaced by a fragile, haunted look, were splashed across newspapers and TV screens. The public was divided. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, while others sympathized with her as a vulnerable woman driven to the brink by betrayal. The prosecution painted Daniel as a victim, albeit a deeply flawed one, who did not deserve to die. They emphasized Marilyn's wealth and privilege, arguing that she had other options besides resorting to violence. The defense, however, focused on Marilyn's mental state, her history of grief and isolation, and Daniel's documented pattern of manipulation. They portrayed her as a woman pushed to desperation, not by malice but by fear and emotional exploitation. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The judge, taking into account Marilyn's age, her lack of a criminal record, and Daniel's actions leading up to the incident, sentenced her to 5 years in a minimum security facility. It was a sentence that sparked debate, too lenient for some, too harsh for others. In the quiet of her prison cell, Marilyn Harper found herself facing the harsh reality of her actions. The silence was different here, sterile and cold, not the comforting stillness of her Greenwich estate. Yet, in the solitude, she had time to reflect on the choices that had brought her to this point. She thought of her children, Elena and Theo, who had once looked to her as a symbol of strength and grace. Now, they visited her out of obligation, their faces a mix of pity and disappointment. Marilyn could see the pain in their eyes, the betrayal they felt, not just from Daniel's actions but from her own. They struggled to reconcile the mother they loved with the woman who had taken a life. One day, during a visit, Elena sat across from Marilyn, her expression guarded. "Why didn't you come to us, Mom?" she asked quietly. "Why didn't you tell us how bad it had gotten?" Marilyn's voice cracked as she replied, "I was ashamed. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want you to see me as weak." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "We didn't need you to be strong all the time. We needed you to trust us." Their conversation ended in silence, but it planted a seed of hope. Marilyn realized that, while she couldn't undo the past, she could still try to mend the broken bonds with her family. Marilyn spent her days in the facility reflecting on her life. She began writing letters to Elena and Theo, pouring her heart onto the pages. In these letters, she admitted her mistakes, her fears, and her regrets. She wrote about her loneliness after losing their father, the joy she felt when Daniel first entered her life, and the devastating realization that it was all a lie. Most importantly, she wrote about how much she loved them, even when her actions failed to show it. For Marilyn, the letters became a form of redemption, a way to confront the pain she had caused and offer her children a piece of the mother they had once known. By the time Marilyn's sentence ended, the world outside had changed. Her estate in Greenwich had been sold to cover legal fees, and the lavish life she once led was a distant memory. Elena and Theo were waiting for her on the day of her release, their expressions cautious but kind. As they drove away from the facility, Marilyn felt a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. She had lost so much, her reputation, her home, and a part of herself she would never get back. But she still had her children, and perhaps that was enough. Marilyn's story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how easily vulnerability can be exploited, and how far desperation can push even the most composed person. For Marilyn, it was also a lesson in humility and the importance of connection. Her letters, filled with raw honesty and regret, became a bridge to her children, slowly mending the relationship that had been strained for years. As she stepped into her new, simpler life, Marilyn resolved to find peace, not in the grandiosity of her past but in the quiet strength of moving forward. She would never forget Daniel Chase or the choices that led to that fateful night, but she would use her story as a reminder to others: trust, when misplaced, can be a dangerous thing. What do you think about Marilyn's story? Was her reaction to Daniel's betrayal justified, or were there other paths she could have taken? Do you think her sentence was fair given the circumstances? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what you would have done in her place. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales of love, betrayal, and the dark corners of human behavior. Stay tuned for our next story. It might just leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and relationships.